The stone mortar sat in the same spot it had occupied for 40 years. Every morning, before light reached the valley floor, a woman in southern Crete ground herbs with oil, wild oregano, sea salt, the first press from last season's harvest. The oil was thick enough to coat wood. It pooled in the worn basin like amber. She used it on bread, on beans, on boiled greens pulled from the hillside an hour before. Her husband, a shepherd, carried a flask of it into the mountains. He would dip hard bread into it at midday, sitting in shade while the flock grazed on thyme. Their children grew tall. Their bones didn't break. At 70, she still walked 3 miles to the village without stopping. No one called this a diet. This was ordinary life in 1935, and they consumed more fat per day than most modern nutritionists would currently recommend. This wasn't isolated. Across the Mediterranean, from Andalusia to the Aegean, peasant households ran on fat, not as indulgence, as infrastructure. Olive oil was currency. It was medicine. It was preservation. It was eaten in quantities that would now trigger warnings. And yet, cardiovascular disease was nearly absent. Metabolic disorders were rare. The populations that relied on these foods most heavily lived longest. This wasn't accidental. What we call the Mediterranean diet today is a reconstruction, a modern attempt to reverse engineer something that wasn't designed at all. It simply worked. And when researchers first documented it in the 1950s, they were trying to solve a different problem entirely. Why were Americans, with access to more food, more medicine, more resources, dying faster from heart disease than subsistence farmers on Greek islands? The answer wasn't what they expected. It wasn't about eating less. It was about eating differently. But the question underneath was sharper. What had we stopped measuring? We optimized for shelf life. That's not a moral failure. It's a technical one. In the mid-20th century, food production faced a logistics problem. How do you feed cities that can't grow their own food? How do you keep products stable for weeks in warehouses, trucks, stores? The answer was to stabilize fat. Animal fats spoil. Cold-pressed oils go rancid. Butter needs refrigeration. So the industry turned to seed oils, cottonseed, soybean, corn, that could be extracted with heat and solvents, bleached, deodorized, and bottled into something that could sit on a shelf for a year without changing. It worked. It scaled. And it quietly replaced nearly every fat humans had eaten for millennia. The assumption was simple. Fat is fat. Calories are interchangeable. A gram of soybean oil delivers the same energy as a gram of olive oil. Thermodynamically, that's true. Biologically, it wasn't. Here's what we measured. Calories, weight, cholesterol levels. Here's what we didn't. Oxidative stress, inflammatory response, hormonal signaling, mitochondrial efficiency. The Mediterranean peasant wasn't counting macros, but her diet had already solved for variables we hadn't named yet. This is where modern systems struggle. What made traditional fat consumption work wasn't the fat alone. It was the structure around it. Break it into principles. Principle 1. Stability under heat. Olive oil is mostly monounsaturated. That means it doesn't oxidize easily. You can heat it, store it, leave it in sunlight. It remains chemically stable. When fat oxidizes, it fragments. Those fragments circulate. They lodge in tissues. They trigger immune response. This happens invisibly. You don't taste rancidity at the cellular level. Polyunsaturated fats, the kind in most seed oils, are fragile. They oxidize during extraction, during bottling, during cooking, during digestion. The Mediterranean diet didn't avoid this because someone knew the chemistry. They avoided it because unstable oils didn't exist. They used what lasted. What happens when you remove this? You get systemic inflammation no one can trace to a specific meal. You get repair mechanisms that never turn off. Principle 2. Fat as part of whole food. The Cretan shepherd didn't eat fat in isolation. He ate it with bread, whole grain, often barley, with vegetables, with legumes. Fat slows digestion. It blunts insulin response. It allows nutrients to release gradually. This wasn't planned. It was affordable. Meat was expensive. Oil and bread were not. So meals were built around starches, vegetables, beans, with fat as the delivery system. Modern eating inverted this. We eat fat with refined carbohydrates, with sugar, with additives designed to enhance palatability past the point of satiation. We eat it faster. The body can't process speed the way it processes volume. This is what convenience replaced. Principle 3. Seasonal restriction without trying. Even in abundance, Mediterranean peasants cycled. Harvest brought surplus. Winter brought scarcity. Spring brought greens and game. Summer brought fish and fruit. The body adapted to variation, not restriction, but rhythm. Modern supermarkets removed rhythm. You can eat the same foods year-round, the same combinations, the same caloric load. There's no reset, no cellular cleanup triggered by scarcity, no metabolic shifting between fuel sources. Abundance became constant. And the body, which evolved to handle abundance temporarily, began storing it as pathology. Principle 4. Local fat reflects local need. In northern climates, populations ate animal fat, butter, lard, tallow. In southern climates, olive oil. In coastal regions, fish oil. This wasn't philosophy. It was proximity. But proximity encoded information. The fats available locally had co-evolved with the foods, the climate, the activity patterns of the people eating them. A Scandinavian fisherman eating cod liver oil in winter is consuming what his metabolism expects during cold, low-light months. A Cretan farmer eating olive oil in summer is getting what works under sun exposure and physical labor. Modern diets pull from everywhere. Tropical oils in temperate regions. Seed oils that didn't exist as food until industrial processing made them cheap. The mismatch isn't dramatic, it's cumulative. Mass alone wasn't enough, but we'll come back to that. The average American now consumes more omega-6 fatty acids than any population in human history. Not by choice, by default. Soybean oil is in bread, in salad dressing, in restaurant fryers, in packaged snacks, in infant formula. It's cheaper than alternatives. It's neutral in flavor. It extends shelf life. It also oxidizes in the body. And the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3, once roughly 1-to-1 in human diets, is now closer to 20-to-1 in industrialized nations. That's not a small shift. It's a metabolic environment the body doesn't recognize. The consequences show up slowly. Chronic fatigue that doesn't resolve with rest. Inflammation markers that stay elevated. Skin conditions. Joint pain. Autoimmune flares. Anxiety that seems untethered to circumstance. These don't trace to a single meal. They accumulate. And because they accumulate invisibly, they get treated as separate problems, each with its own intervention, its own prescription. No one asks, what if the baseline changed? The Mediterranean peasant didn't worry about inflammation, not because she was healthier by virtue, but because the foods available to her didn't create it. Her diet wasn't optimized, it was constrained. And those constraints happened to align with what the body could process indefinitely. Modern diets removed the constraints. We can eat anything, anytime, in any combination. And the body, designed for scarcity, for seasonality, for effort, runs on surplus. It was never meant to manage continuously. This is where the fragility enters. It wasn't stupidity that replaced olive oil with soybean oil. It was incentives. In 1900, the average American ate roughly 2 pounds of soybean oil per year. By 2000, that number was over 60 pounds. Not because taste changed, because production changed. Soybeans became a commodity crop, subsidized, mechanized, efficient. Extracting oil from them became cheap enough to make it the default. And once it became the default in industrial kitchens, in food manufacturing, in restaurants, it became the default in human bodies. No conspiracy, just economics. Centralized food production required fats that could survive centralization. Olive oil couldn't. Animal fats couldn't. So they were replaced by fats that could. The population adapted, or tried to. But adaptation takes generations. Industrial food moved faster. The same logic applied to everything else. Whole grains were stripped and enriched because refined flour was easier to store and transport. Fermented foods disappeared because pasteurization extended shelf life. Seasonal eating vanished because global supply chains removed the need for it. Each change made sense in isolation. Each optimized for scale, cost, convenience. And each removed a variable that had been quietly regulating human metabolism for thousands of years. The experts didn't know what they were removing. They measured vitamins, calories, protein. They didn't measure what happened when you ate the same food every day for 50 years. Why this knowledge is returning? It started in the research. In the 1990s, scientists began noticing something strange. Populations that ate the most fat weren't the sickest. The French paradox, the Mediterranean diet studies, the Inuit, the Maasai, the Tokelawans, high fat, low disease. The explanation wasn't that fat was good or bad. It was that the type of fat mattered more than anyone had predicted. And the context around it mattered most. By the 2000s, the data was undeniable. Replacing saturated fat with industrial seed oils hadn't reduced heart disease. In many cases, it increased it. Removing fat entirely and replacing it with refined carbohydrates made things worse. The advice had been backwards, not maliciously, just incompletely. We'd measured the wrong variables. Now there's a quiet return: ancestral health movements, regenerative agriculture, slow food coalitions, people seeking out cold-pressed oils, pasture-raised animals, fermented staples, not as nostalgia, as repair. Practical translation. You don't need to live like a 1930s cretin to understand what worked. You just need to recognize the principles. Eat fats that don't oxidize easily. Olive oil, butter, coconut oil, animal fats from well-raised sources. Avoid oils extracted with solvents or heat: soybean, corn, cottonseed, canola in most forms. Not because they're poison, because they're unstable. Eat fat with whole foods, not refined ones. Fat on vegetables is different than fat on sugar. The body processes them through different pathways. One builds, one inflames. Allow rhythm. You don't need to fast, you don't need to restrict. But eating the same thing every single day removes the variation your metabolism expects. Seasonal eating, intermittent breaks, simple cycling. Even partial adoption changes outcomes. Prioritize proximity when possible. If you live where olive oil grows, eat olive oil. If you live where butter is local, eat butter. Your body adapted to what was available in your region for millennia. Industrial food broke that connection. You don't need to restore it perfectly. Just acknowledge it exists. The return. The stone mortar is still there. Not in the same kitchen. That woman is gone now. But the object remains. The motion remains. Herb and oil ground into paste. Spread on bread, still warm. It wasn't complicated. It didn't require science to justify it. It only required that it worked, and that the people who practiced it survived long enough to pass it on. Somewhere, someone is still doing this. Not because they read a study, because their grandmother did it. And it made sense. Modern research is now catching up to what peasant diets never needed to explain. Fat isn't the enemy. Instability is. Calories aren't neutral. Context is everything. Optimization for convenience isn't the same as optimization for health. And the body, resilient as it is, still runs best on the foods it adapted to across centuries, not decades. We didn't lose this knowledge because it failed. We lost it because we replaced it with something faster. And now we're learning. Faster isn't always forward. The old way wasn't perfect, but it was stable. And stability over time is what survives.